Okay, so this is Mrs. H Psychology, specifically for AQA Psychology, paper 3 on gender, but this time it's the GID, gender identity disorder, and it's part 2, so I'm going to cover the social explanations. You'll see there's a GID part 1 which covers the biological, and I'm going to refer to that in this as well, but just in very summary form. So you've got the detail you need in part 1, so we will just refer to those little bits here. So if I bring this up, here we have our second explanation that we need for the specification. So specification says gender identity disorder, biological and social explanations. So in your textbooks it will refer from time to time to psychodynamic and cognitive, but we're just going to home in on here this social explanation. So I've used the page references that we will use. So little revision guide, Illuminate we use, and also Hodder book 2. Okay, so what is the social explanation? The idea here is that gender identity disorder is learned. All right, so social is that it's learned through the environment, really, through perhaps social learning theory and also the behaviorist concepts of operant conditioning. Remember, those two are separate. So SLT explanation is that we will observe, here would be gender behaviors, and we imitate them. So we're observing role models and imitating them. And obviously you want to get these keywords in with SLT, with any explanation on SLT. So we're learning vicariously, indirectly. Okay, so what we'd be learning here would be opposite sex behaviors with gender identity disorder. So obviously with SLT, you're also trying to make reference to mediating factors. And here, these would be alternative behaviors are somehow reinforcing for us. So in other words, we somehow get pleasurable consequences, good consequences, and so we're reinforced for that opposite sex behavior in some way. So for example, cross-dressing, something like that. Obviously, we want to refer to operant conditioning, so reinforcement, which comes from the behaviorist concept, okay, of operant conditioning. Reinforcement is going to be used. So for example, here, positive reinforcement may be in the form of attention or praise, the way it makes them feel, so if they feel more happy, identifying as the opposite sex and that sort of thing, they are going to be reinforced for it. So we will need some evidence for this, and in Hodder we've got reference to Recker's piece of research, 70 gender dysphoric boys. They found that there was more evidence of social than biological factors, and one of the common factors was there was a lack of stereotypical male role models. So the implication is that a lack of male behaviours to observe and imitate might explain that feminine behaviour being copied. You can also refer to other things that we've covered in our notes and a video on SLT. So we've got reference to B, Mead, Margaret Mead, for example, Furnham, with the research, media research, and so on and so forth. So you could refer to any of those being role models and make reference to them, picking out tiny bits of detail from your notes on SLT. Also here we want to make reference to cross-cultural research. So for example, in Illuminate book 2, we've got something about the Hurjas, the 5 million Hurjas in, for example, in Pakistan, and Fa Afarin in Samoa. And we've got reference down here, a little clip from that for you to refer to. So this is from the Illuminate book 2. All right, so okay, and we've also got worth you going into YouTube and just googling some of this and having a look at the clips. There's also a reference here to another article which I'm just going to bring up. Okay, so you can type that in, and we've got an interesting article here giving you a little bit more information as well. Okay, so you can just search for it and you'll find you know, information on the internet as well. Okay, so I'm just going to pause. I'm going to take that off the screen. You can pause the video and have a look. Just scroll down once again so you can pause and have a look at that. Okay. So we've got a bit of information about the social approach. Not as much reference that we have for biological. So we've done biological in part 1. We need to obviously evaluate social. I'm going to show you an essay plan at the bottom in a moment. But evaluation probably, obviously you're going to refer to very strong evidence from a biological. So we've put a lot in our GID video 1, but you can refer to SWAB or ZOO, and differences in using postmortems and the structural differences in the brains of individuals, particularly in this area, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. Okay, we've also got reference to genetic evidence. So these pieces of research that we've referred to in part 1 here, for example, Helen's compared 23 MZ twins with 21 DZ twins. MZ, of course, monozygotic, identical twins, 100% same genotype, whereas DZ will only be the same as siblings, so half the same genetic makeup. And they looked at them where one of the twin was diagnosed with GID. And what they found was 9 of them, so 39% of the MZ twins, were concordant, meaning they were similar for GID. So when one was, the other one was as well, but only 39% of them, compared to none of the DZ twins. So obviously that implies that there is something genetic going on, and there's a biological cause going on, but 39% is, as we'll refer to later, is not particularly high. You got also evaluation like Hines arguing that people who experience this dysphoria, a dysphoria which persists into adulthood, face such emotional or psychological hardship that really it's unlikely to be just a social cause. It has to be probably a biological cause, is his argument, because of what they have to put up with in their environment. We've also got things like Bennett, while social learning theory can be used to explain it, it doesn't fully explain the strength of feeling and the resistance to therapy experienced by individuals with GID. And obviously, that is better explained by this biological evidence that we've referred to. We mustn't forget that, this is a very socially sensitive topic. Obviously, this is about people's identity. It's very important that we handle this sort of research extremely carefully and very sensitively, and that we need to make real reference to ethics like confidentiality, protection from harm, and that's worth an evaluative point as well. Now, you can, and you will see in the mark scheme with one particular question that they have made reference to psychoanalytic explanations. So I've referred here as an extra point. For example, Oversee et al. Explain it. GID is caused by separation anxiety before gender identity is developed, so before gender identity in the phallic stage. The idea being that the boy fantasizes about a symbiotic fusion with the mother and therefore identifies with her and internalizes her gender identity as opposed to a masculine one, for example, with boys. This is supported by Stoller. GID males did, the males that they interviewed, did describe very overly close relationships with their mothers and so on and so forth. Okay, and obviously with any psychoanalytic we have the same evaluative points. It is, we have very little scientific evidence. It's unfalsifiable, but it's untestable because this separation anxiety and also the whole process of Oedipus and Electra in the phallic stage is in the unconscious, so we can't test it scientifically. We have terms that we can't operationalize and so on. And always we would put in that there are alternative theories, and you've got reference to research above. Ditto, if you really needed extra, there is also a cognitive explanation. But really we have plenty there with a social explanation, particularly when we are evaluating it in terms of a biological. So let's have a look at the question that came up in the summer 2017 exam paper 3. Discuss what psychological research has told us about atypical gender development. Atypical gender development. It's an essay question for 16 marks. And if we have a look and I scroll down, you'll see the content that they were expecting. So if you've looked at my GID part 1, you will see a lot of this biological information in there. But here we've got social explanations, operant conditioning and reinforcement, identification, imitation, modelling, lacking a stereotypical male role model, We could include things like extreme separation anxiety with psychoanalytic, and you could even include cognitive. Okay, we've got cultural variations in there. So we've covered our, and obviously always mention mismatch between external sexual characteristics and psychological identity. Okay, so there's plenty of AO1 discussion points, counter arguments really. So we've got, you know, counter evidence in terms of other approaches, comparisons between these explanations, and making sure we've got some of this covered. Social sensitivity, for example, biological, for example. Okay, biological approach, mentioning nature over nurture. Also, some of the research being correlational, so not showing causal links, but also this is definitely worth mentioning, the real distinction between their cross-gender behaviours, but also their real beliefs, their behaviours. All right, so there's a difference between maybe cross-dressing and them actually identifying as the opposite sex. Okay, and it's important that we get that across. These are people who identify with being the opposite sex. They don't want to temporarily dress as the other person, the other gender. They actually identify. They feel that there is a mismatch between their biological sex and how they feel. Okay, so we've got that content, and we've covered that. So if I show you the knot scheme, the levels, first of all, so if you have a look at that, you can pause the video and have a look at level 4. Obviously, this is what we're aiming for. So knowledge of what psychological research has told us is very accurate, generally well detailed. Discussion is thorough, and we've got perhaps minor lack of argument and things like that. I'm just going to show you now possibly an example of how we can start to structure an essay. Okay, so I'm going to show you a template which might be quite useful in terms of structuring your essays. Okay, this is what I use with my guys. So obviously, probably you're familiar with point, explain, evidence, and so on. This is just a suggestion. I mean, it's not perfect, but it will certainly get you started. And I would recommend that you're trying to, for level 4, you're trying to get at least 3 of these bands, really. So as an example, here, maybe you could say social explanation is using social learning theory. In other words, that we always want to introduce some terminology. We observe role models and we imitate them. So what do we mean by this? This explanation believes we learn vicariously, i.e. indirectly. So the idea here is that GID is learned from the environment, this explanation. Evidence for it, illustration perhaps. So it can be supported by cross-cultural research. Maybe put a little bit in there. However, so your evaluation, you're starting to do a however. Culturally, these individuals are accepted. Sorry, we could develop here. This is maybe developing this point, or we could put in a however. Culturally, these individuals are accepted, and therefore they're also acting as role models to be copied. So at this point, I'm just developing this. But then I'm going on to my however. An alternative explanation could be that GID comes from biological explanations and evidence from, for example, postmortems. Then I'm going to give a little bit of detail about that, and then I'm going to link it back to my exam question. What this implies is it's the brain structure that's causing this dysphoria rather than any social influences. So I'm finishing off this point, but then I'm bringing it back to my social. So the social would say maybe reinforcement is more important, it's involved. What do I mean by that? Explaining that. So positive reinforcement, how would we do that? So attention, praise, or maybe the way it makes them feel when they behave in ways that are typical for the opposite sex. So for example, dress like them, and eventually they'll identify with them. Maybe a bit of research to support that, records, for example. And you can pause and just have a read of that. And now we're going on to our evaluation. However, researchers like Bennett say, whilst SLT can be used to explain it, it doesn't really fully explain the strength of feeling and the resistance to therapy experienced by those people with GID, which is better explained by perhaps the biological approach. And then we bring in our biological as an alternative, perhaps, a little bit of evidence. And although clearly it shows that there are low concordance rates for this, so there's got to be an environmental influence as well. But you know, MZ should have 100% if it's all genetic, and clearly we haven't got that. So once again, we see there is interactionism between social and biological forces, and maybe at this point you can write in, you can also include nature and nurture reference as well. Okay, so bringing in your issues and debates. And then for level 4, I would recommend that you're doing another one, perhaps with an alternative as well, just to show how we develop that a little bit. Okay, so hopefully that you'll find that useful in terms of your essays. And so if we go back to the exam question, so that was a 60 marker, as you know, that's the highest marks you can get for an essay, and we're really trying to make sure we include some discussion there. Okay, so hopefully that will help.